They voted for hope. They got a bill. In 2024, Senegal surprised the world. A young electorate, a peaceful insistence on democracy, a new president, elected not by force, but by patience. The message from voters was simple. Life is too expensive. Jobs are too scarce. Power must be accountable. For a moment, Senegal looked like proof that democracy still works. Then the numbers surfaced, quietly, brutally. $13 billion in hidden debt. Suddenly, dignity met arithmetic. Sovereignty met credit ratings. And hope met austerity. I want you to pause here, because this story is not really about Senegal. It's about what happens when democratic demands collide with economic reality, especially in countries where trust is fragile and margins are thin. If you care about how democracy survives in the real world, stay with me. This is where the tension truly begins. And to understand why this debt cuts so deep, we need to step back and look at the problem more clearly. What exactly is the problem Senegal is facing? It is not simply debt. Many countries carry debt. It is not simply politics. Senegal just proved its democratic institutions still matter. The real issue is collision. Voters demanded affordability. They demanded jobs. They demanded fairness and accountability. At the same time, the state discovered it was far poorer than it believed. A $13 billion hole changes everything. It narrows choices. It hardens trade-offs. Raising taxes sounds responsible until you remember that nearly everyone works outside the formal system. Austerity sounds disciplined until you remember why people voted for change in the first place. National dignity sounds powerful until investors start listening more carefully than they did before. This is the dilemma facing Senegal's new leadership. Deliver change without money. Protect sovereignty without isolating the economy. Keep public trust while asking for sacrifice. And beneath it all sits an uncomfortable question. How did this debt remain hidden for so long? To answer that, we need to rewind, because today's crisis did not begin in 2024. To understand how Senegal arrived here, we have to look past personalities and protests. For years, growth masked fragility. Budgets expanded, projects multiplied, debt accumulated quietly, out of sight. None of this felt unusual. Governments borrow, markets lend. As long as confidence holds, the system keeps moving. But confidence depends on transparency. And transparency, in this case, was missing. Somewhere along the way, obligations stopped appearing in plain view. Liabilities were deferred. Accounts became opaque. Risk was pushed forward in time. This is how hidden debt works. It doesn't explode immediately. It waits. By the time voters demanded change in Senegal, the economic cycle had already turned. Global conditions tightened. Credit became more expensive. Tolerance for uncertainty vanished. What looked like political renewal collided with a balance sheet built for another era. And that collision created pressure not just on policy, but on trust. Trust between citizens and the state. Trust between leaders themselves. Trust between Senegal and the outside world. That pressure was about to surface, and when it did, it would force impossible choices into the open. Because the first real crisis was no longer theoretical. It was operational, and it was unavoidable. The shock came all at once. A downgrade, a credibility hit, a sudden recalculation of risk. Markets did what markets always do when surprises appear. They pulled back, they demanded reassurance. They raised the price of doubt. Inside the government, the tone hardened. This was no longer about vision. It was about survival. Prime Minister Sonko drew a line in the sand. No debt restructuring, no humiliation, no treatment like a failed state. On paper, it sounded defiant, even noble, but in practice, it narrowed the field of options even further. If you won't restructure, you must collect more revenue. If you collect more revenue, you must tax harder. And if most people already live in the informal economy, pressure falls on the few who are visible. This is where ideals met constraints, where sovereignty met solvency. If you want to understand why this moment matters, pay attention. Because crises don't announce themselves with explosions. They arrive as decisions that remove every easy path. And Senegal had just entered that phase. To see why this response carries hidden risks, we need to look beneath the rhetoric, at the system quietly shaping every choice ahead. What looks like a political argument is, in fact, a structural trap. Senegal's leaders are not choosing freely. They are reacting inside a narrow corridor shaped by debt, trust, and time. Start with taxation. In theory, raising revenue is sovereign. In reality, when nearly everyone works informally, the tax base is thin and fragile. Push too hard, and small businesses disappear. Push too softly, and the numbers don't add up. Now add investor psychology. Capital is not patriotic. It is cautious. Talk of nationalization, punitive taxes, or confrontation travels faster than clarifications ever do. That means every public statement carries a price tag. Then there is credibility. Hidden debt doesn't just damage balance sheets. It damages belief. Once trust erodes, even sensible policies are viewed with suspicion. This is the hidden mechanism at work. Debt limits policy. Uncertainty amplifies fear. Fear shrinks options. So the debate is no longer about left or right. It is about whether a young democracy can absorb economic pain without fracturing. Because when expectations are high and resources are scarce, every delay feels like betrayal. And this pressure does not stay abstract for long. It moves outward into politics, into society, and soon it would surface again louder, sharper, and closer to home. The second crisis was not triggered by markets. It was triggered by people. Suspicion spread quickly. Who knew about the debt? Who signed what? Who looked away? Finger pointing filled the silence left by missing answers. Inside the leadership, tension became visible. Between restraint and defiance, between caution and confrontation. This is what debt does when it turns political. It stops being a number. It becomes a weapon. Every faction claims moral ground. Every explanation sounds like an excuse. And every delay deepens mistrust. For citizens, the math is simpler. Prices are still high. Jobs are still scarce. Promises are still waiting. When expectations rise faster than results, patience collapses. This is the danger zone for any young democracy. Not repression, not coup, but disappointment. Because disappointment doesn't shout at first. It withdraws, it doubts, it disengages. And once that happens, the democratic miracle people celebrated months earlier begins to feel fragile. To understand what this crisis really means, though, we have to stop looking at leaders and start looking at you. The real test of any system is how it responds when people lose trust. When frustration sets in, it doesn't stay in the streets. It moves into the home. It eats away at hope. It shifts the balance between public duty and private survival. For the youth in Senegal, the promise was clear. Change was coming. A better future was on the horizon. But when that promise collides with the weight of economic reality, something else emerges. You stop seeing the future. You start living day to day. The debt wasn't just financial, it was emotional. It was the weight of promises unmet. It was the toll of seeing your government scramble without answers. This is where the citizen's voice matters most. Because when the state loses its ability to fulfill even the basics, when your cost of living keeps rising and your job prospects keep falling, you stop believing in the system altogether. Senegal's leaders now face a moral choice. Do they push ahead, demanding more sacrifice from a population already stretched too thin? Or do they finally confront the hard truth of their situation and admit that the current path cannot lead to the promised land. The next chapter in Senegal's story won't just be about economics. It will be about hope and whether a broken promise can ever be mended. But beyond Senegal, there's a lesson here for all of us. Because this isn't just a tale of one country's struggle. It's a story about how trust once broken affects everything. Now the world is watching. Senegal's choices will have consequences far beyond its borders. The decisions that its leaders make won't just define the future of one country, they will echo through the global system. For starters, debt is a shared problem. It's a problem for any nation squeezed by loans it can't repay. For any economy where rising debt is paired with a shrinking ability to collect revenue. And the longer Senegal hesitates, the longer it will feed the narrative that African nations are trapped in a cycle they can't escape, that they are nothing more than pawns in a global economic game. But if Senegal succeeds in negotiating a path forward, if it balances sovereignty with accountability, reform with transparency, it will have set an example. It will have shown that the future doesn't have to be a deadlock between democracy and austerity, that there is room for a new kind of economic realism, one that respects the will of the people while safeguarding the state's long-term stability. The world will be watching not just for the economic results, but for the moral results. Does Senegal restore hope or deepen despair? And here's the global reality that every politician should understand. What happens in Senegal won't stay in Senegal. This will ripple through economies everywhere. The choices made now will decide not just Senegal's future, but perhaps the future of entire regions. The future of Senegal is not preordained. There are three possible scenarios. Each one has its own set of consequences. Each one demands hard choices. First, the optimistic scenario. Debt restructuring and tough fiscal reforms lead to stability. Trust is slowly restored. Senegal's economy begins to grow again with a focus on long-term sustainability. In this future, Senegal's leaders are able to balance debt management with job creation, attract international investment, and revitalize key sectors like agriculture and infrastructure. They rebuild public trust by being transparent and by making clear that the people's demands for fairness and accountability will be met. This is the best-case scenario, but it requires bold, visionary leadership. It requires making hard choices today for the promise of a better tomorrow. And even then, it will take years, maybe decades, to heal the scars of this crisis. Second, the middle ground scenario, a compromise that allows for some restructuring, but not enough. The country muddles through, but with limited growth and persistent dissatisfaction. In this reality, Senegal might avoid a complete breakdown, but it could also fall short of the hopes of its citizens. The public's trust remains fragile, and economic growth stagnates. Politicians play the game of managing crises instead of solving them. This scenario keeps the system from collapsing, but it also ensures that the promise of change remains unfulfilled. And if the public perceives that they've been cheated, the cycle of distrust will continue to grow. Finally, the pessimistic scenario. A failure to deal with debt effectively results in further economic decline. The rift between government leaders deepens, and citizens grow increasingly disillusioned. In this scenario, Senegal faces a collapse of public confidence. Austerity measures push the people to the breaking point, and protests and social unrest grow. Investors pull out, and the country's development is stunted. This scenario doesn't just hurt Senegal. It sends a message to the world. Democracy is not enough when economic foundations are not secure. The stakes, then, are clear. Senegal's future hangs on finding the right path forward, a path that doesn't compromise democratic ideals, but also doesn't ignore the harsh economic realities of the moment. The stakes are high, and the moment is urgent. This is not just a story of numbers and policy choices. It's about human lives, the lives of the young, the ambitious, and the hopeful who voted for change. Senegal's story is about dignity, the dignity of a population that has struggled for years under the weight of unemployment and rising costs. It's about the fight for fairness, where corruption no longer has a place in the halls of power. And it's about sovereignty, the right of the people to define their future on their own terms without being tethered to an economic system that doesn't serve them. But dignity, fairness, and sovereignty are not just words. They are actions, they are promises that need to be kept. And when governments fail to fulfill those promises, the people will notice. They will demand accountability. This is where Senegal finds itself now, at a crossroads between the demands of its people and the weight of its economic reality. The people who voted for change are waiting. They are waiting for the leaders they elected to fulfill the vision they promised. This is not just about what happens in Senegal. It's about what happens when a country's economic model fails to keep pace with its democratic ideals. It's about the tension between the will of the people and the realities of governance. And it's about the lesson we all must learn. There is no easy way out of debt. There is no easy way out of crisis. But there are paths that can lead us forward. Paths where we do not abandon democracy, where we do not give up on our people, and where we do not allow fear to dictate our future. The future of Senegal and of democracies everywhere will depend on how we face these tough realities, how we rise to meet the challenges of our time, and how we ensure that the people's voice is heard. As we approach the end of this story, the question is no longer about Senegal alone. It's about all of us. It's about every nation, every society, every individual who is living in the shadow of a system that feels increasingly unsustainable, who is watching democracy struggle under the weight of economic pressures. In Senegal, the stakes couldn't be clearer. The future is at a tipping point, but this moment holds potential. If we can learn the right lessons, we must ask ourselves, what is the price of sovereignty and how much are we willing to sacrifice for it? Can we build an economic future that reflects the values of fairness, dignity, and opportunity? Can we restore trust not just in our governments, but in the very idea that democracy can deliver on its promises? This is a choice that belongs to everyone, not just the leaders in power, but the citizens who hold them accountable. Senegal's future can still be shaped by the will of its people, and the will of the people can still redefine what is possible in a world where too many have given up on democratic ideals. As this chapter closes, one thing is clear. The fight for Senegal's future is not over. It is just beginning. And the world will be watching, because how Senegal moves forward will speak to the resilience of democracy itself. This is the challenge for Senegal and for all of us. Will we rise to it, or will we let the pressures of debt, distrust, and desperation define us? The answer is in the choices we make today.